How many they're asking
The
for?
private sector in its post
I think
central
it's about
bank
4 million.
statement suggested that they are not being consulted.
The private sector.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
enough.
Mm-hmm.
So far, we've been told that no consultations have taken place with the private sector regarding the budget, this coming budget.
Mhm.
When do you expect to begin speaking with the private sector to hear what they may have, their input really, into the 2014-2015 budget?
Well, we normally have a process. Nobody, but certainly the private sector doesn't know when the budget is. We normally set a process, and as you know, we invite all of the private entities, stakeholders to come, and we meet with them. But outside of that, we hear them quite often. They have their say. Most of them, if you don't hear them privately, you certainly hear them publicly. They issue statements on all types of things. They make submissions, as is their right to do, on various aspects of government policy. So, whilst the tradition has been to have a grand thing where you invite everybody up here and you sit down and they make a presentation and you have a back and forth and so forth and so on, and that tradition will continue, we are pretty much familiar with what the private sector has been recommending because they have been doing so consistently. Now, I must make the point, though, that and I heard these comments coming from the head of the Private Sector Association about government and the Chamber of Commerce as well, about government coming to them and presenting its program every few weeks or something like that. And that's not how it is done. Reports on the Barbados economy are done by the central bank. The Ministry of Finance do periodic press conferences, periodic press releases. We release information through the Division of Economic Affairs on all aspects of the economy, whether it's prices, employment, whatever the case may be. This is done routinely. Now, I don't know what else people expect. I'm at a loss as to what else they expect us to do in the circumstances. If it is that they expect that we're going to have every 2 weeks a sit down and officials of the Ministry of Finance and myself are going to report on everything that's happening on the Barbados economy point by point, I don't think that is a useful exercise, because a lot of the data which we receive, we ourselves have to be constantly checking and rechecking and so forth and so on. So it is a very dangerous thing to be giving people data that we are not ourselves entirely satisfied or sure about in terms of its finality. And I keep explaining this to the private sector, that it doesn't quite work that way. Even the figures which we would have given you here, these figures, by the end of the next quarter, some of these can change, and probably will change, based on additional information that is brought in. So therefore, what we give out and what we engage, I think, is useful. But I must add that an exercise is being conducted, and the acting director of finance, who of course is the substantive PS Economic Affairs, can tell you about this. An exercise is being conducted for the reform of the Barbados Statistical Service. And one of the things that we are going to be doing in those reforms, and that is at a very advanced stage, is to set a legislative calendar for the reporting on the economy by the Statistical Service and by other entities in the system responsible for sharing of economic data, financial data with the public. And that is to bring a level of certainty and transparency to the process. The consultants, this IDB project, the consultants are very far advanced in their work. It would involve an entire reform and restructuring of the statistical service. Yes, and we will, but that will, be more akin to what you will see in developed countries, so that the dates on which this information is coming out, just as you will see in the United States. People know when employment data is coming, when GDP data is coming, and so forth. We're moving to that process, and that work is at an extremely advanced stage, with legislative and executive cabinet decisions to be made.
Cash flow challenges that them is experiencing. Given the fact that you're having to go with cuts, obviously to meet deficit targets, is it a situation where now you have to extend the date, because as we know the interest factor comes in at
Yes, and that's a very good point. Of course, as you know, or as we should probably explain. Shouldn't say that you know. Refunds of all types, income tax, VAT, whatever the case may be, are paid from revenue. They are a docket on your revenue. There's no special fund that is kept anywhere out of which these returns are paid. They are paid from revenue. As revenue comes in, then those returns are paid out of the revenue. If there are cash flow or revenue shortages, then you could expect that there will be a slowing of that process. And that has happened. Some other issues have come on board as well. The establishment of the BRA, particularly for things like VAT and so on, that have delayed those returns processing is a major issue, of course, and the limitation of human resources to do this. But the principal issue has been the availability of actual cash to pay those returns. We have started paying returns. People have gotten some of their returns as well, and we will continue that process apace. Of course, the point that you made is a very critical point, that interest kicks in after a certain point in time, and we don't want that interest cost to explode and then, cause us a different headache. So we are trying as much as possible, as we get the revenue, we have the space to pay. If we can't do that at a fast enough rate or a large enough rate, then we would have to look at other instruments that may be necessary to achieve that process.
Do you have a target in mind in terms of when you'd like to finish that process?
Well, I would like to finish it as soon as is humanly possible. But again, that's in keeping with the situation, and I know it has been very disconcerting and discomforting for many Barbadians, and of course we apologize for that circumstance, and we ask Barbadians to be patient. We know a lot of people rely on that. We try to get out, as certainly the smaller amongst to those persons who rely on those to do things like back to school and so forth and so on. But it is a tight situation, and we ask for the patience of Barbadians in this regard.
Just a quick question. You're talking about the private sector, and now the rank of latest advocate. And we heard in the private sector some saying that the government is moving too slow, some of the gaps are not closing quick enough. You had the public sector retrenchment, and we heard in the chamber when they had a meeting about going to the IMF Financial Agreement. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, we are not satisfied with the pace either. We feel the pace could be greater, but we have to look at the type of economy we have and deal with the realities of what we have before us. We have a very large social sector in Barbados that we've afforded an extremely high quality of life for Barbadians. And anytime you're doing major adjustment in an economy of this nature, it is going to affect those areas: education, healthcare, social welfare, community development, you name them, across the spectrum. And though you want to achieve targets in the fastest possible time, you still have to be mindful that you're operating within a fairly small space with a fairly vulnerable population, that if you do too much too quickly, you can actually unravel the entire society. And that we do not want to have happen, because there are persons who are, making it out on a daily basis, but not necessarily so far above the water level that they can't slip below. And we don't want that situation to happen. So we have to be very guarded and mindful of what you're doing. The second point is, we have not been helped entirely in this race to get our deficit down with the or by the growth in revenues. These have been slower than we have anticipated. We understand that to some extent, because if you do a heavy-set fiscal program, particularly with expenditure cuts and taxation, you tend to find that aggregate demand contracts, and when that contracts, economic activity contracts, GDP contracts, and you don't get as much as you want. We have to look at what the overall objective is. The overall objective is to ensure that we have adequate levels of foreign reserves, foreign exchange in the country, to keep us in the game. That we have achieved. Now, having achieved that, we're looking at ways in which we can work around those situations, use that stability to achieve greater levels of revenue through increased economic activity. Now, I heard the private sector speaking, and I share some of their views, but I also have to make the point that we have, over the last few years, put so many things in place. I mean, incentives, concessions, waivers, partnerships, in which government has taken on a greater part of the risk than even the private people, to accommodate the private sector, to invest in our economy. And that is why I believe that one of the things that we would like to hear from the private sector more often is not so much what government should or should not be doing. We encourage them to say that. But we also want to hear from the private sector what are they proposing to do to get our economy going. If this is going to be a private sector-led economy, and I did hear the president of the Private Sector Association say he's not sure what words to the effect that he wasn't sure what it is that the government or the central bank expected from them in terms of private sector. We expect investments. We expect them, people who are sitting on the fence, and it's not all of them, because there's some very aggressive people in the private sector who have not stopped investing, and we know who those persons are. But we are saying that the incentives have been there. We have done waivers of for the private sector of debt owed to government, whether it is to the various taxes, VAT, and so forth and so on. We've done those things. We are saying the foreign private sector expressing higher levels of confidence in what is happening in Barbados than sometimes our domestic folks. And that mixed match needs to be changed, because the domestic people should be driving what is happening here, even as we invite those from outside to come in. So we're saying that we need to work together. They have some legitimate points that we take on board, of course, but we feel that can happen a lot faster if, in terms of economic growth, if they come on board with us and they come on board with the country and let us move forward. Now, in relation to the discussion about going to the IMF, we have said what our position is. We are not contemplating any IMF program at this stage. We do not think it is necessary. We believe that Barbadians can achieve the objectives of the program that we have set ourselves. It is not going to be easy or painless, but I know that the alternatives, which some people are clamoring for, will be far worse than they may suspect. So we've measured the situation, and we feel at this stage that that is not required at this stage. What you do is, naturally, as anybody would do, for example, as you would do in your household, I hope, you prioritize. If you have to cut, you look at the areas that are most critical and are most sensitive. And if education and health are two of the areas that you would want to try as much as possible to stay as far away from as possible, then you do so. Of course, given all the public health issues that we have in the various mosquito-borne illnesses and potential for Ebola or whatever the case may be, you have to make sure that you're on top of your game in that regard. So you will try as much as possible to stay away from them. Equally as well, national security. It's another area that we want to ensure that you do not compromise, because security is a large part of the stability of the country, both as a tourist destination but also naturally for Barbadians. So those types of installations, police, defense force, fire service, and so forth and so on. So you work around those and you try to isolate those, and then you would make your adjustments in the other areas that would be considered to be important but not necessarily absolutely critical.
Now, also in the central bank report, it indicated that foreign capital inflows had picked up. This was estimated at 399 million. This is compared to 173 million last year. How much of foreign capital inflows was made up of foreign borrowing? The reason I'm asking is because the report is not specifically clear if there was an increase in foreign direct investment, and how much was any increase in fact?
Yes, there was an increase of over $150 million in foreign direct investment over the period for the year to date. The monies which you would have been referring to in relation to the foreign borrowings recorded for this year would have been the smaller amount of the Credit Suisse loan that we would have taken out what we call the green shoe, of I believe $70 million, if my memory serves me correctly. That would have come in $70 million US, if my memory serves me correctly. That would have come in March. So the substantial amount of those resources that you've seen there in relation to foreign inflows are not from borrowed money. You stand up on anybody's shoe with your foot, or their foot with your shoe, they're going to say, "Aye, there's no way that you can do that, unless you are featherweight. There's no way you're going to do that without causing the person some level of discomfort." And we understand that. And we try to work as much as possible to lessen that rate of discomforture. But at the end of the day, these decisions are the decisions that will modulate and moderate that level of debt growth. By pulling that fiscal deficit down, pulling government out of the market for short-term debt in particular, and so that you can bring that trajectory down. Now, it's not going to happen in the short term because the deficit is as high as it is, but it is a medium-term objective. So you will see it go up, as you have seen it, in the short term by some. But if you get the deficit down below a certain amount, it will stabilize, and then you will begin to see that trajectory going down. That is why these things are increasingly more important to be done, and that we have to meet those targets. And if we have revenue shortfalls, we have to find ways of boosting that revenue or find other ways of adjusting. Making cuts to expenditure, discipline or supplementaries, and these kinds of things. And that's the program we are doing. If there is a better mousetrap, then I say bring it. Let us see how it is how it is going to be done. Because at the end of the day, there is no way to get a deficit down other than cutting it. Of course, if you get an explosion of economic growth, and your GDP expands, you'll see that rate coming down. But we know that in an economy like Barbados, that has not had 5% growth in years. In fact, on average, our growth has been what? 3% for the last 20, 30 years. So we're not going to see, unless something radical changes around here, like you discover oil or something like that, you're not going to get the 5 and 6 and 7% growth. So you're not going to get that. So you have to work within certain constraints. You have to focus on your medium-term growth and development strategy, do the structural changes to the economy that you require, upgrade your investment grade, which we've been doing, introduce new sectors like alternative energy, and hope that in the mix, over time, that all of those produce the type of results that you require to at least bring you to a reasonable and sane level of fiscal spending.
To what extent have your colleague, Dr. Eswick's proposals have been heard?
Hold a second.
You haven't answered the question
Yes.
about whether you've considered resignation, given the heavy criticism that you've been on for years.
Well, no. The answer to that is no. I have not. And, I am a fighter. I'm not here to, I don't run away from a task, and I don't throw as the Shakespearean term will go, I don't throw my sweaty nightcap in the air because people believe that, they don't like me, or they don't like the policies I'm pursuing, or the government is pursuing, or whatever the case may be. This business is not for the faint-hearted, and is not for the thin-skinned. You have to be able to take the criticism, see the ones that are constructive, and adopt those changes that are required. The ones that are more negative, see them for what they are, and and be with them as such. I try to do the best that I can in the circumstances. I try to benefit from the advice which I get from these guys. And of course, at the end of the day, the final decision is mine, working in conjunction with my cabinet colleagues at cabinet and the government as a whole. And that is what we try to do. So, no, I don't walk around every day considering whether I should leave the office or